Hey everyone, Sindhu here. I wanted to share some thoughts on BIPOC representation because in recent years we have seen a huge push to diversify leadership and put people of color in positions of power. And rightfully so, because it is important to diversify leadership in our workplaces that are becoming increasingly racially diverse. Representation is so important and it is needed. However, representation on its own is just not always enough to ensure inclusion. There are so many amazing Black, Indigenous leaders of color who are catalysts of inclusion and leading the culture change that we need to see in our organizations. However, there are also so many BIPOC who sit in leadership positions who perpetuate the systems of racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of oppression to only exacerbate the toxic workplace culture that they were probably hired to help change in the first place. So rather than uplift and empower and create pathways for success for their direct reports and other minoritized employees, these leaders can sometimes create harm and traumatize employees, and they do a great deal of damage to the organizational culture. Not only is this harmful to historically underrepresented and excluded employees who were probably at one point so excited to be led by someone who they saw in themselves, but it sends a negative message about BIPOC leadership to the larger organization, and it can make an organization reluctant to continue their commitment to diversifying leadership based on one unfortunate experience. I have seen this happen several times in my experience in higher ed and also as a DEI and anti-racism practitioner. And that's because as a society, we tend to collectivize people of color while individualizing white people. One of the reasons I am ultra passionate about this conversation is because I myself have experienced the unfortunate repercussions of having a BIPOC leader who did more harm than good. And I know firsthand just how painful this experience can be. The first and only time I worked under a woman of color, the situation was so toxic that I found myself extremely stressed, depressed, and contemplating leaving the career that I fiercely love. The damage this leader created has left me with deep wounds that I am still trying to heal from, 4+ years later. Zora Neale Hurston tried to warn us about these types of leaders when she said, "Not all skin folk are kinfolk." And I think that it's time that we collectively listen to her wise advice, because sometimes leaders of color can create harm and perpetuate systems of oppression that so many of us are working hard to dismantle and disrupt. We can look to mainstream media and specifically politics to understand how BIPOC leadership does not guarantee inclusion or liberation. Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley are two South Asian Republicans, and they are living proof that not all skin folk are kinfolk. Vivek has publicly denied the existence of racism, and Nikki has whitewashed our nation's racist history to appeal to her right-wing voters. We can also look at the infamous example of Clarence Thomas, a Black Supreme Court judge who since the early 80s has perpetuated anti-Blackness and undermined the system of racism that has worked to disenfranchise Black Americans for centuries. When we, as Black, Indigenous people of color, find ourselves in leadership positions, it's so important that we understand the responsibility that we have to empower, uplift, and create pathways for the success of other BIPOC and minoritized individuals. We can and we should be disruptors of a toxic workplace culture rather than perpetuators of one. In order to do so, it's so important for us to work on unpacking our internalized oppression that many of us hold, reject tokenism, and help ensure that folks from minoritized communities have a seat at the decision-making tables of our organizations. It's also imperative for us to engage in cross-racial solidarity and empower the BIPOC employees we work with, and also challenge and question the organizational policies and procedures and programming that work to disadvantage BIPOC employees and communities. I strongly believe that BIPOC leaders who understand that our oppression is intertwined and our liberation is bound have the potential to be the most impactful and empowering catalysts and gatekeepers of inclusion of our workplaces. So please remember that although it is important to work towards diversifying leadership, a racially minoritized leader doesn't always guarantee inclusion or liberation. Thanks for listening.